Good morning. If you want to turn to 2 Samuel 13, that is where our lesson text for today is found in this new study. Second lesson of David and Solomon. Last week we saw from chapter 12 about two sons, one that died 7 days old, and then one that was born subsequently or later, Solomon. So that lesson was called Two Sons. This lesson is called Two Brothers. And it is about two of David's other sons. And this is one of the darkest, disturbing accounts among, there are some front runners in the Old Testament, particularly in the book of Judges, to be honest, but this is a horrific situation from start to finish in 2 Samuel 13. But as we saw in our lesson last week, after David did all that he did in connection with his affair with Bathsheba, the prophet Nathan told him of his punishment. And primarily, our focus is verse 10 of chapter 12. Now therefore, the sword shall never depart from your house. That, he said other things, I guess, probably said more, and then he says a little bit more in verse 11, but he says, I will raise up evil against you out of your own house in verse 11. Those two things together. The sword will never depart from your house, and I'll raise up evil against you out of your own house. That is sort of verse 11, the beginning there is sort of an elaboration of verse 10. The sword would never depart from his house. There's going to be turmoil. There's going to be unrest. It's not going to be great for David's house. Whether or not he fully understood the meaning of that, he would learn pretty soon. It wouldn't take long for him to learn what exactly that prophetic declaration meant in his punishment. So our lesson text, which is chapter 13, the second half, I guess we could call it, of chapter 13, reports the beginning of this unrest in David's house, if we can call it the beginning. It's the first part that's specifically talked about within his own house. And it all began with a very unsavory obsession of David's oldest son for one of his half-sisters named Tamar. So in order for us to properly look at or examine the situation that our lesson is about, we have to understand what led up to it. So it's this obsession. Amnon, David's oldest son, was obsessed. That's the best word I can think of. It never uses that word that I know of in the text, but that is what this was. With the full sister of another one of David's sons, Absalom. So his half-brother, Amnon's half-brother and half-sister, whose name was Tamar. She was a beautiful young woman. And verse 1 of chapter 13 says he loved her, but the further we read on, we'll see love's probably not a great word. Again, obsessed with her is really what was happening here. It says he was tormented, so tormented about this, that he made himself sick because it seemed impossible to him to be able to do anything to her. However, Amnon had a friend, a cousin/friend, who is really one of the main villains in my mind one of the main villains in this whole chapter. He's always in the shadows, but he is a major player in this chapter. He came up with an idea. An idea not to smack some sense into his friend and cousin Amnon. A real friend would have said, Amnon, don't ever speak a word of this to anybody ever again. I'll pretend like I didn't hear about this, and you better pretend like you never thought it. That's what a real friend would have done. But what Jonadab, which was this guy's name, he said, and the text says he was a very crafty man, which is about to be proven. He asked Amnon what in the world was going on with him. He's been acting funny lately. And he tells him. So Jonadab, instead of saying the kinds of things I just mentioned, he comes up with an idea to enable Amnon to do what he viewed to be impossible, which was to violate his half-sister Tamar. What a great man. So he came up with this plot. The details are irrelevant. But it involved, first of all, going to his father, their father, and asking for Tamar to come to his apartments and to serve him. Which is unusual, isn't it? Because if you're the royal family, you're going to have servants that wait on you in everything. Not your sister. She was as royal as Amnon was, so she has no business as far as, royalty, the general view of royalty is concerned. She has no business waiting. I mean, what? She's no servant girl. I've given you servants. They can give you your food or whatever. But he insisted, no, I want Tamar to do it. And David's first mistake in this connection is apparently being somewhat oblivious. And he says, okay, Tamar, go and do it. And the rest unfolded exactly as Jonadab's plan intended. When she got close to him, to Amnon, he took hold of her and demanded that she lie with him. She resisted, but he was stronger than she was, and he overcame her. And then, perhaps, I hesitate to say the worst part, but the cruelest part is afterwards, he tells her to get out. In fact, the text says, let's see the verse here. Verse 15, then Amnon hated her with very great hatred, so that the hatred with which he hated her was greater than the love with which he had loved her. So as much as he was obsessed with her for however long, years probably, or a considerable amount of time, the hatred with which he hated her now even outweighed the love, the obsession that he had for her.
Really, probably though, he hated himself and seeing her.
Yeah, part of it was probably self-disgust, but not to the extent of taking it out on himself.
And verse 17's really powerful.
Yeah. She pleaded with him, but he wouldn't listen. So then he tells the servant, he called a young woman in, arguably, likely the young woman that should have been serving him in the first place instead of Tamar. Now he tells her to come in and get her out and lock the door. So the last picture we see, or not the last picture, but we see the picture of her leaving with ashes on her head, and she had torn the long robe that she wore, which was the kind of garment that the king's virgin daughters wore. And she is no longer one of the king's virgin daughters. And crying aloud as she went. Now, her brother Absalom, who up to this point, will be a hero of sorts. He tries to comfort her very generously for him and for his brother's sake, the way he worded it. Of course, that was going to change soon. But he invited her into his house to live because now she is a desolate woman. And the language there, though it's not really emphasized in the text, what Amnon did to her permanently was one of the cruelest and most horrible things that anybody could do to a young woman. She's not going to be able to find, different than today, when this kind of unfortunate tragedy would not necessarily render the victim, permanently desolate. It was different back then and in that culture. She's been ruined. She will be alone the rest of her life. So Absalom takes her in to his own house, his own home, because of this. Now, here's the next mistake David made. This is verse 21. Now, when King David heard of all these things, he was very angry. That's it. That's it. That's all of it. Now, some manuscripts add a little bit more, but it's debatable whether that's genuine. The point is, David did nothing. He didn't do anything. He got mad. That's it. And I would submit that decision is set off the dominant, even more than just the sin with Bathsheba, which, as we already pointed out, the connection is all of this is the fulfillment of what Nathan said the way it would be. But this amplified it and exacerbated this situation. David did nothing. Can you imagine? Put yourself in David's shoes. You just found out that your son raped your daughter. And all you did was get mad. Didn't do a thing. No matter how much you love your son, he deserves to be punished. He deserves to be in prison. Something. Stoned to death, even. Nothing. Yeah, Dean?
Well, of course, we know that David also realized that this was fulfilling what Nathan had told him the prophet. And the thing is, could he have done anything? This was prophesied that this was going to happen. So there's nothing that really, yes, he probably could have went and killed him and so things, so it's still going to happen to him. Because all through the rest of his life, through his family, is going to be. So, in some ways, could David really have done anything?
Yeah.
Because of the fact that it was prophesied. There was nothing that he could do to change it. And it was a result of what he had done.
Yeah.
And so, but yet, like you said, though, you think he should at least done something.
Yeah, he should have done something.
Should have made him at least be accountable for what he did in
Yeah,
because David had to be accountable.
He should still have done the right thing. And here's the thing, again, about prophecy is the sword would never depart from his house. It's not that David literally couldn't do anything, but God had already seen it all happen. Which would include, this is like the mind-bending nature of prophecy, kind of like time travel. If David could go back in time and execute Amnon, how would it have changed things? Well, it would have changed them. It wouldn't have changed the prophecy from being fulfilled, because even if it stopped right here and in our lesson text for this morning never happened, that's still part of the fulfillment of Nathan's prophecy about his punishment. His son rapes his daughter and then he has to be executed. That's a horrible tragedy for the house of David. But because of David's negligence, it was going to get even worse. So Absalom, in response to this, and I would argue not just in response to what Amnon did, but in response to what David didn't do. It says, Absalom spoke to Amnon neither good nor bad, for Absalom hated Amnon because he had violated his sister Tamar. So Absalom has resolved, he has ceased all communication with his brother. Period. He wouldn't, that's what we're being told in verse 22. He spoke neither good or bad. He did not speak to him at all. Probably plenty of awkward, environments, atmospheres in a room where they both are, where you can cut the tension with a knife, because Amnon may have tried to speak to Absalom over this time, the next couple of years, but Absalom would not speak to Amnon. And people were going to start to notice that. Well, that was just the beginning of all that Absalom was going to do. He was biding his time. He was waiting. We're not told that here, that he was lying in wait, but he was. Because verse 23, that's where our lesson text begins. After 2 full years. 2 full years of what? 2 full years of festering hatred and sinister patience. Absalom had sheep shearers at Baal Hazor, which is near Ephraim, and he invited all the king's sons. What does this have to do with anything? Well, it's unfolding here. Sheep shearers was an extremely joyous time for the Hebrews as shepherding people. They had a big celebration, a big feast for it. Absalom came to the king and said, "Behold, your servant has sheep shearers. Please let the king and his servants go with your servant." Come with me. The whole house. This was very calculated. If David agrees, it would probably mess the whole thing up. But it was such a heavy request that he probably knew David wouldn't do it. So he asked, and as expected or anticipated, the king resisted. It's like, that's way too much. There's no reason for that. Unnecessary. But Absalom pressed him until he let Amnon and all the king's sons go with him. So, okay, if you won't all come, well, at least let all the king's sons come. And he let him. Or he agreed to this. Maybe he never mentioned Amnon by name, even though the text singles him out, in addition to all the king's sons. Well, now, I skipped verse 26. Verse 26 is where he singles out his brother. At least, please let my brother Amnon. But then David agreed to let all the king's sons go. So the king said, "Why should he go with you?" See, that should have been a light bulb.
How could he have forgotten?
2 years have passed. That's a long time. Let's face it. You may have trouble remembering something that happened 2 days ago, or 2 weeks, or 2 months. 2 years is a long time ago. But not something like this. Whenever your son has actively been neglecting your other son.
And you have a daughter that is not eligible to get married.
Yeah, the daughter, all this stuff is going to be in the forefront all the time. At least if David had been paying more attention, you would think. If not all of you, then at least let Amnon come. Wait a minute. And it did seem to throw up some red flags. Why do you want Amnon to go? But that was it. That was as far as he took his inquiry. He didn't go any farther. So then he pressed him until, okay, all the king's sons were going to come. Which maybe he thought that was a good idea because, hey, if they're all there, surely nothing will be able to happen. If he was even thinking about that at all, which he doesn't seem to have been doing. Yeah, Joe?
Well, Tamar was in his house for those full 2 years,
Mm-hmm.
which meant every day he saw her suffering.
Yeah.
And so that would have fed it. I mean,
Every day his anger would be,
rekindled.
or multiplied, keep building and building and building. And, we can't help but sympathize with Absalom a little bit there. We know it's not good to let anger fester up inside of us and this bitterness and hatred. But at the same time, we can hardly blame him. I mean, he had basically taken we don't know the age difference between Absalom and Tamar, but he was basically a father figure to her. We don't get any sense of a father figure, a fatherly role of David for her actual father. But anyway, David had agreed to let the sons go, so Absalom commanded his servants. Here's the plot.
Yeah, everything Absalom is doing is what you would expect a dad to do. Like, obviously, a dad is going to want to kill the person who violated his daughter. Even though, I mean, it's not right to do that, but I'm saying to have those...
And if it hadn't been his son, he would have. There's no doubt about it.
So Absalom is having all the feelings you would expect a dad to have, obviously.
Yeah, I mentioned some manuscripts that add a little bit to verse 21. What some of them add is that he was very angry, but he wouldn't punish his son Amnon because he loved him, because he was his firstborn. Again, that may not be genuine in the text, but it's implied. I mean, even if it's not stated, that if that had been just some, ruffian type guy, he would have been dead. No question. And fast. But it wasn't just some thug, criminal out in the public sector, or one of the servants. It was one of David's own sons, and not just any son, but his firstborn son, which would have been legally his heir. Of course, we know that from our perspective, looking back in hindsight, Amnon was not ever going to be the heir to the throne. But that person was already, his birth has already been recorded in chapter 12. His name's Solomon. Yeah, Joe?
Well, I think the reason the armor of God includes the breastplate of righteousness, and then when you read in Psalms, David's sin was always before him. He knew what he had done with Bathsheba. And so you can't help but wonder if it's like, well, I can't say anything about this because I did my own sin.
Yeah, sometimes that reasoning.
Doing what God wants, he's worried about himself.
Yeah, that doesn't really work as a principle in parenting. I did the same thing. I mean, first of all, it doesn't even make sense. It's just an excuse to not be a parent. Well, who am I to punish them for doing the same? I did those things and worse. Yeah, I did bad things. I did these things. I made these mistakes when I was a child, a teenager. So I want my children to make that doesn't even make sense. But the one thing we have to remember is, even though it's impossible for a reader, especially if you read chapter 11 and then chapter 12 and then into chapter 13, you're automatically going to connect, maybe at least, maybe not automatically, but Amnon's behavior with David's own behavior. However, there's never any indication that Amnon had any idea about what his dad did before he was ever born. I think it was before he was born, maybe not, but sometime before. Don't put the timing in stone. But anyway, there's no indication that anybody but Nathan ever knew about it. David, Bathsheba, Nathan, as far as people on earth.
I think Amnon was already born because he had 7 sons born
Okay.
before he went to Jerusalem.
So he's already born, but nobody knew. And, even if some people knew, your kids are probably going to be pretty far down on the list of people who find out about that kind of thing. The misbehaviors of parents. Your kids, they will be the ones, maybe most of all, that you don't want to know. But my point is, there's no indication that Amnon knew about what his dad did. So it's not like he could have reasoned in his head, hey, Dad did that. So, look at what Dad did. He wanted that woman even though he had no right to her, and he made it happen. So I want to be like Dad. There's no reason. There's nothing that would indicate that Amnon had any clue about what David did. At the same time, can't help but see that connection, at least, that he was sort of doing that kind of like his... Yeah, David knew, so that still applies to maybe his withholding, just all the same. Or maybe not all the same. If he knew that Amnon knew, then it may have been even more. But he still knew, so maybe he held back. To me, the language of the text seems more towards the inclination that David was just absent-minded about what was going on. Yeah.
There's no indication, not only, punishment is you punish a wrongdoing, but where was the teaching from David about God to his sons, to his family? Where was, in other words, the instruction ahead of time? I don't see it. A lot of times I guess maybe it was left to the mothers.
Yeah, that's the irony of David's whole life, really, is he was a great king, but we don't see a whole lot of helpful evidence that he was a great father. It's similar, as we're going to see in the life of Solomon. We're told he was the wisest man on the earth. And he was. He did apply that wisdom in a governmental sense. But we learn between the lines that spiritually and practically wasn't that great. So the kingdom as an entity thrived under Solomon's reign, but it was actually crumbling from underneath him because of the very things that made it as glorious from the outside as it was. So David was a great king, arguably the greatest. I would say he is the greatest king they ever had, if not for a statement somewhere in the Old Testament that Josiah was the greatest king they ever had. But if David's included in that statement, then that would keep somebody from saying David was the greatest. But David was arguably one of the greatest, second greatest maybe, but his parenting suffered for whether it's a cultural thing or what, a royalty thing. There's really no excuse, because the law, whatever God's teachings and principles are as related to parenting would apply to a king as much as it would a blacksmith or a baker or anything. So David's negligence is just not helping things. So Absalom commanded his servants. Here's the plot. You get Amnon nice and drunk, and you mark when he is sufficiently drunk. And then whenever I give you the order, strike him and kill him. And then he says some words that are very eerily familiar. He says, "Do not fear. Have I not commanded you? Be courageous and be valiant." Does that sound like anything to you? Have you heard those words before? I never noticed this until I was reading it again earlier this week. It's almost exactly what God said to Joshua in Joshua 1. When he's telling Joshua to go into the land, it's just the do not fear is after. So he says, be courageous and valiant. Have I not commanded you? Don't be afraid. That's exactly what Absalom is saying to these servants here in reference to murdering his brother. So that's kind of eerie how exact those words are. So the servants of Absalom did to Amnon as Absalom had commanded. And then all the other king's sons panicked, rightfully so, and took off. Because you know what? How they would interpret this is Absalom is an official rebellion for the throne. He's going to kill all of us. You know why they thought that? Because that's what people always did. If you're going to try to take over a kingdom, you got to kill the current king, but you also got to kill all of his sons, and they would kill all his family and everybody. So they think that's what's happening, so they take off. It says, while they were on the way, news came to David. So somebody took off a little faster than the others. And out of sheer ignorance, not malicious intent, they told David what they had anticipated was happening. Absalom has killed all the king's sons. Not one of them is left. And the king arose and tore his garments and lay on the earth, and all the servants around him did the same thing. So a horrific situation. But then Jonadab comes back into the picture. He was David's nephew. We were told earlier that he was the son of Shimeah. Now we're told that Shimeah, if we're not told earlier, is David's brother. He says, no. That's not right. Don't even think that. Absalom has not killed all of them. He's just killed Amnon. So, strange words to say. He says, let not my lord the king so take it to heart as to suppose that all the king's sons are dead, for Amnon alone is dead. Don't worry. Be comforted, king. It's just your firstborn son that's dead, that's been murdered. Well, in the long run, that might amount to something, but in the moment, that's not the best news he could have hoped to hear. But, there's so many question marks that David should have, if not now, because he's in a heavily emotional state, afterwards, my mind probably would have started to think about, how did he know? We don't even know how he knew this. We know that he knew what Amnon did, because everybody knew that now, it seems. But what we didn't know was that Jonadab knew that Absalom was planning to go and kill Amnon. But apparently he did. He didn't just put two and two together. He says he knew somehow that only Amnon had a target on his back. For all he knew, if he didn't know anything about it, is, well, maybe he did kill all of them. But he knew somehow. But there's never a question mark about, wait a minute, how do you know that? If you knew that he was planning this and you didn't say anything, but none of that ever happened. Maybe that's another sign of negligence. But Absalom, however, flees the scene, flees the country, and Jonadab, so proud of himself, it says, the young man who kept the watch lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, many people were coming from the road behind him by the side of the mountain. And Jonadab said to the king, behold, the king's sons have come. See, it's just like I told you. See? Look. Now give me a reward or something. Yep.
Are these king's sons, are they the ones born to his wives, or just the wives, or are the concubines' children even considered sons and daughters, or what?
I believe it's just the wives. He had several. He had multiple wives at this point. And I can't remember which chapter it mentions some of them, other than Michael. But I don't think Michael ever had.
It's in chapter 3.
Okay.
And they were all from wives, so I was thinking, well, what about 100 or more concubines he's got? They had children.
Yeah, well, if they did, they wouldn't be in the.
They wouldn't have been in the lineages.
Yeah, they wouldn't have been in the royal. Okay. The different list of the children and who their mother was.
It was only the wives.
Yeah. Which, he could have had several sons from even one wife. But when you got 2 or 3 or 4 wives, it'll multiply pretty quick. 6. So, yeah, just the wives. But we can understand how much confusion that will cause in a royal family. If you got 6 wives, technically, somebody could argue you've got 6 firstborn. Huh? Okay, yeah, Michael never gave him any children. But Absalom has fled. Jonadab's proud of himself. He says, see, just like I said, looking for a promotion maybe. And as soon as he had finished speaking, the king's sons came, lifted up their voice and wept. And so now we have the king's sons, all the other sons, minus Absalom and Amnon. We've got the king himself and all the servants. Just a big, huge mourning, group mourning. Mm-hmm.
Now, with Jacob, is a little bit different story. His sons also included the comfort. Well, I guess they would be wives. But they have, because the handmaids of his.
Yeah, legally.
Yeah, I guess they would be wives.
Yeah, unfortunate arrangement, but technically the way they viewed that was it still was from them, which is, crazy to our ears, in our minds that can't imagine anything like that being the acceptable custom to do. But legally, technically, that was still considered Rachel and Leah, all of them being from Rachel and Leah, on paper anyway. So Absalom fled and went to Talmai, the son of Ammihud, king of Geshur. Why in the world would he go there? That was his granddad. We're not told that here, but probably a nice little piece of information to write out in your margin or something that Talmai was his maternal grandfather. It was his mom's dad. That's why he went there. We're not given any explanation as to why he went there, but other information fills it in that, you see, that was his grandfather on his mother's side. If anybody would sympathize with what he's just done, it's going to be his mom's side, because remember, Tamar was his full sister. Amnon was they just shared a father. They didn't have the same mother. They had different fathers. Absalom and Tamar, though, were full-blooded siblings. So if anybody's going to sympathize, which a sin is a sin, and even if you love Tamar and are broken emotionally for the rest of your life because of what Amnon did to her, murdering him in cold blood and premeditated murder is still sin, and you shouldn't sympathize with that ever. But this is his best chance. I guess he flees there for the safety of his life. But we read that David mourned for him day after day. The text just says he mourned for his son, but that could be, which son is that talking about? It could mean Amnon, it could mean Absalom. He probably mourned for both, even though the text just says one of them in that case. So Absalom went there for 3 years. And verse 39 says, the spirit of the king longed to go out to Absalom, because he was comforted about Amnon since he was dead. So he longed to go out, not to ruin the moment, because that sounds like such a warm and comforting statement. The word translated go out doesn't mean he wanted to go out like the father of the prodigal son, He longed to go out, but he waited for him, but he longed to go out to him. He would have wanted to go out to him. That's not what is said here. Apparently the word translated go out here means in a hostile sense. He longed to go out to get him. I know that isn't nearly as satisfying as the picture David longed day after day to go out to him. He even though he did this terrible thing, we could see that David felt guilty probably for his own negligence, and maybe he reflected on the idea that if I had done what I should have done, Absalom wouldn't have felt the need to take justice into his own hands, which that is a fact. Whether or not David reflected in that way, we don't know, but we do know that that is a fact. If David had executed justice, then Absalom would not have wanted to execute vengeance. It is the direct absence of justice that leads to vengeance. So we can't say that if David had punished Amnon to some extent short of death, Amnon wouldn't have wanted to kill Amnon, or Absalom wouldn't have wanted to kill Amnon, because he may still have wanted to. But if David, it at least would have lessened the temptation for him to take matters into his own hands. But David did absolutely nothing to Amnon. And therefore, Absalom said, okay, I'll do it myself. And he waited, and he waited, and he waited. Patient man. Sadly, Absalom's behavior doesn't stop there, but it's going to eventually get even worse and further fulfilling Nathan's prophecy. The sword will never depart from your house. Because after these 3 years went by, soon Absalom is going to work his way back into the city and the castle, or whatever we want to call it, and even back in trying to get back into the good favor of his father David, only for him to throw that all away. More plotting. So it seems that Absalom really resented his father for some reason. And I don't see any reason more obvious than his negligence in dealing with Amnon. Mm-hmm.
If he had been taught Jewish law, and he knew that his sister could not have called out for help, couldn't he have considered himself the avenger? Because that was the pronouncement of what happened to his sister.
Yeah, that's only when they're out in the country, I think, isn't it?
Well, it just says if they cannot.
Well, if they're in the city and they don't call out, which, I can't imagine her not having done that. We're not told, because we're not given the details of when it happened. We're just told that he grabbed her and he said, lie with me, and he overcame her because he was stronger. Surely, there was somebody in a close enough vicinity to hear resistance. But, again, that is just whether or not the woman is guilty of adultery in that case or whatever. If the woman doesn't make an attempt, then she's also guilty. That's just the way the law was set up. That the man's guilty anyway, but the woman is guilty only if she doesn't make some attempt to cry out for help. So Tamar's guilt is not even in question. I mean, her innocence is not even in question. She's 1,000% innocent in this, which is obvious not only because we're told that she resisted, but because she obviously would have anyway. But Amnon's guilt, just like Tamar's innocence is never questioned, Amnon's guilt is never questioned. So David had no excuse at all. And even if doing what he did didn't disqualify him from the throne, legally, it should have, because you don't want that kind of man on the throne. I mean, history is riddled with kings who take what they want when they want it, and they don't care what's in the way. That Amnon was proving to be that spoiled little brat that he was, even before he was king. So he obviously was not fit for the throne. Of course, like we already pointed out, Solomon was already destined and meant for the throne by the will of God. So these are all things that God has already seen happen that was going to ultimately lead to Solomon being the heir to the throne. Just like there were things that God saw that led to Jacob being the heir instead of Esau, even though Esau was the firstborn. God had already seen it all. He didn't have to make these things happen so it would come to pass. He already saw it come to pass, and so he beforehand said that it was going to come to pass.